Hello and welcome to Get Yourself Optimized. I'm your host, Stephan Spencer, and today it's my distinct pleasure to have Dr. Jim Tucker with us. Jim is the Bonner-Lowry Professor of Psychiatry and Neurobehavioral Sciences at the University of Virginia. He's director of the UVA Division of Perceptual Studies, where he is continuing the work of Ian Stevenson with children who report memories of previous lives. He's the author of Before, Children's Memories of Previous Lives, a new 2-in-1 edition of his books Life Before Life and Return to Life, which together have been translated into 20 languages. Jim, it's so great to have you on the show.
Well, thanks very much for having me.
So I'm curious, how did you end up wanting to study and kind of lead this whole effort looking at past life memories? Is this something that you've experienced yourself?
No. In fact, how I got involved is sort of a long story. So I'm a child psychiatrist, and I trained at UVA both in psychiatry and child psychiatry, and then went into private practice just doing ordinary routine child psychiatry work. And then when my wife and I got together, she believed in reincarnation and psychics and so forth, which got me kind of intrigued. And then I had heard of Ian Stevenson, who started this work in the 60s, but knew almost nothing about him. But I discovered that this serious-minded work into the question of life after death was going on at UVA, and eventually called them up and just asked if they needed some volunteer help interviewing patients, and kind of one thing led to another. But it was never my primary interest. Was not particularly in reincarnation. I was more intrigued by just the overall question of survival after death, and again, the serious-minded approach to that question. That was really appealing to me.
Right, and so the science behind this is pretty much indisputable, right? There is scientific evidence that is very convincing around past life memories being real and not fabricated.
Yeah, certainly nothing is indisputable, because plenty of people will dispute anything. But there is certainly very solid evidence that young children from all over the world, including here, have memories of a past life that can be verified to match somebody who actually did live and die in the past.
Right. So what would be an example of a child that you had worked with, interviewed, included perhaps in one of your books, who had memories that couldn't have possibly come, at least seemingly, from anywhere else?
Yeah, so one of the cases which is pretty well known is a little boy named Ryan in Oklahoma. We got a letter from his mom one day when he was 5 saying that for the last year he had talked on a daily basis about a past life in Hollywood, and would cry and beg his mother to take him back there. She went one day to the public library to check out some books on Hollywood to see if she could kind of help him process some of this. And they came to a picture from an old movie called Night After Night. And Ryan pointed to one of the men in the picture and said, "Hey, Mama, that's George. We did a picture together." And then he pointed to another one and said, "And Mama, that's me. I found me." Well, the book, the caption didn't list who was in the picture, but the first person he pointed to, the George, was George Raft, who was a pretty well-known actor back in the day. But the one he said that he had been was an extra with no lines in the movie. So Ryan's mom wrote to me to see if I could help determine who this was. I went out and met with Ryan and his parents, and then as we were trying to solve this mystery, his mom was sending me emails sometimes on a daily basis with all these statements that Ryan was making, so we have documentation of them all. Eventually, with the help of a Hollywood archivist, we were able to determine who this man was. The archivist went to the library of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, got all the materials on the movie, most of which was about the stars. But then she found one picture of this guy, and it identified him as one Marty Martin, who was a fellow who died in 1964. So a long time, 40 years before Ryan was even born. And it turned out that Marty Martin pretty much lived the life that Ryan had described. Ryan said how he danced on stage in New York and Marty Martin danced on Broadway. Ryan said that he then went to Hollywood to work in movies, which Marty Martin did, working mostly actually on dance in movies. Ryan said that he then worked at an agency where people changed their names, and Marty Martin started a successful talent agency. Ryan said how he had a big house with a swimming pool and that the word rock or mount was in the street address. And Marty Martin had a large house with a swimming pool on North Roxbury. Ryan also said one time that he didn't see why God would let you get to be 61 and then make you come back again as a baby. Well, Marty Martin's death certificate said he died when he was 59, but I looked into it and found that in fact he was 61, which is what his family said, and also we found census records and marriage license lists that all gave ages that meant in fact Ryan was correct about dying at 61, even though the death certificate said 59. And altogether, we were eventually able to verify that 55 of Ryan's statements matched with Marty Martin's life. And at the time that he said Marty Martin, I did an online search and there was nothing on him. Now there is, since this case got some attention, people have filled in some of the details, but there is no way that Ryan learned about Marty Martin through some sort of ordinary means.
Wow, that's amazing. That's amazing. Yeah. And why do you think 40 years went by? Is that common for decades to go by between incarnations or these current lifetimes and the previous lifetime that is being remembered?
No, actually, it's not common. So in our cases, which of course involve intact memories seemingly coming through, the interval is usually quite short. The average is only 4.5 years. Now, of course, there are outliers with any pattern, and we've had them for more. We've had 50 years. Getting much beyond that, it gets pretty hard to verify, especially the cases like in the Asian villages where Ian Stevenson started his work. I mean, those you had to have eyewitnesses who remember the people, so that that may shade a little bit the sampling that we get, but for the most part, it does seem to be quite recent lives.
Wow, it's amazing. And how does this relate or tie into past life regression therapy? I just recently read the book by Brian Weiss, Many Lives, Many Masters. I'm guessing you probably read the book.
I have, yes, and it's certainly an entertaining book, and it's an interesting case that he describes. However, we're rather skeptical of hypnotic regression, mostly because hypnotic regression is a very unreliable tool even for memories of this life. And unreliable meaning there are times where it's dead on and people are giving license plate numbers from crime scenes or whatever. But then there are plenty of times where the mind just fills in the blanks. And then after that, it's very hard for someone to tell, was this an actual memory or did my mind create that? Well, when you're looking at unverifiable past lives, and most of them are, there's just no way to, unless you can verify that somebody was able to give a bunch of details that matched a past life, there's no way that you can say that it was from a past life. And many of them, or often, people talk about it's an ancient life, ancient Greece or whatever, which of course would be impossible to verify. There are also times where under hypnosis, the details that the people give are sort of historical absurdities, things that don't match up with history that we know. And then there have even been cases where people have been re-hypnotized, asked where the information came from, and it turns out it came from a book that the person read years before and completely forgot about. So all that being said, there's a very small number of cases where it does look like somebody provided information that would have been very hard for them to obtain through ordinary means. But for the vast majority, hypnotic sessions may be therapeutic. They may help people work through various phobias or whatever that Dr. Weiss has documented those kinds of cases. But it doesn't mean that they are remembering a past life that they actually lived before.
Got it. Okay. So would you say that you are a skeptic or a believer in reincarnation at this point, or where do you stand with all of this research, having done all this interviewing of children and everything? Where do you stand?
Yeah, well, I would say that we have good evidence that some young children do have memories of a life from the past. And the most straightforward explanation would be reincarnation. They have those memories because they lived that life. But there are certainly other possibilities to consider. And if you're looking at the realm of consciousness, it may not be as linear as we tend to think of things. So, I mean, as far as whether I'm a believer or a skeptic, I mean, I hope I'm open-minded as I approach every case. And, what I'm trying to determine is what is the quality of evidence in this case that this child does have memories from a life from the past that he or she could not have accessed through ordinary means. And some of the cases, the evidence is weak. I mean, it may be very meaningful to the family, and it may well be legit, but just the quality of the evidence is not strong. And then, of course, there are other cases like Ryan's where the evidence is very strong.
Yeah, I've recently heard of a term I'd never heard of before called evidence-based mediumship. So it's related in a sense in that it's connecting to psychic abilities and something beyond our normal sphere of influence and understanding, but it's focused on getting, without a doubt, evidence that proves that this is the person, the soul that you're connecting with, and not just cold reading or some parlor tricks.
Well, that's right. So with mediums, there's some very serious-minded work that is being done and has been done for a long time, actually, going back to the 1800s, where you have controls. You know that the medium has no access to the person beforehand. They know nothing about the person who's getting a reading. They're kept from getting any sort of information from them. And it's important to have those sorts of controls because mediumship is one area where the vast majority of mediums, at least from people who are experts in it, say the vast majority actually have little or no ability at all. And then you get the sort of the Michael Jordans of mediumship where people do seem to have quite extraordinary talent. But it's important to have the controls to determine, is that talent legit, or like you say, is it some sort of parlor trick?
Yeah, I'm thinking of a movie I just recently saw a few months ago called Kardec. It's about the life of Allan Kardec back in the 1800s, I believe, when the whole spinning tables phenomenon was happening. And he took a very scientific approach to proving when mediums were legit and when they were not. And he was able to go to all these different mediums and talk to the same being or soul on the other side, get the same message each time, and the mediums didn't know each other, and Allan Kardec didn't reveal who he was going to. So that was pretty compelling. And I'm sure there are other studies like that.
Well, right. And with him, there's what's called Spiritism now, which is quite popular in Brazil and other places, that's based on Allan Kardec's work. But there's also the Society for Psychical Research in the UK back in the 1800s, including some quite prominent scientists. And the best known one today would be William James, the philosopher and psychologist, finding some pretty remarkable mediums to study. Again, as well as finding a lot that weren't so remarkable, but there are certainly some that are.
Yeah. Some are actually purposefully fabricating.
Right. Yeah. And of course, you can well imagine people are willing to pay good money to go to mediums. And so there would be some people who would try to take advantage of grieving people and get money from them. But again, there are also some talented ones as well.
Yeah, right. And so where do you stand in that kind of world of, in terms of skepticism and open-mindedness or whatever? Do you have experience with mediums or psychics that to you seem clearly legit because of the personal information they couldn't have possibly known that they shared with you, or with perhaps your wife, or something that would be kind of undeniable?
I don't have personal experience, but our lab here is actually doing a study now with mediums, and other people have done very good work. There's the Windbridge group with Julie Beischel, where they do very controlled studies with mediums and produce some work that I think is very hard to dismiss.
Mm. So what is the most interesting study currently underway at your department that you could share any details on?
Well, of course, they're all interesting, but with the mediums, what the study and COVID kind of caused things to grind to halt for a while. But what they're doing is having mediums give readings to people while they're measuring EEGs, and they're looking to see when the mediums are having a strong session, getting a lot of hits, what is their brain doing compared to times either when they're at rest or when they're not on as much. So that's going to be an interesting study when it all gets said and done. With our work with the past life memory stuff, we're doing a couple of things. One is we've been interviewing adults who we originally studied when they were kids to see kind of how they're turning out. And we're still crunching the numbers, but basically these kids do fine. I mean, they typically stop talking about the past life at an early age, really, around the time of school age, and then they just kind of go on with their lives. The other thing that we continue to focus on is trying to get more really strong American cases because we studied over 2,500 cases from various parts of the world, and people have managed to ignore that work for 50 years. But I think if we had 50 American cases as strong as Ryan's case, then it would be very hard for people to ignore it. So we're continuing to look at cases. I'm going to be visiting one in a couple of weeks, actually, and we'll see what we can find out.
Yeah. Now, there's a case with a boy who remembered being a fighter pilot and getting shot down in the water and above the water in Japan, I think, or somewhere in the Pacific Ocean. Yeah. That made it onto all the news networks and so forth. That was years ago. I remember that stuck with me. I saw that back when I was agnostic and I didn't believe in anything, and I was really intrigued. It sounded very convincing, and I'm curious what your position was on that.
Yeah, that's a very strong case. Yeah, I studied that case sort of after the fact, but yeah, that's James Leininger, who, was this little boy with these Christian parents in Louisiana who started having horrible nightmares of a plane crash, and eventually gave details about how he was a pilot flown off of a ship that he named the Natoma, and described exactly how the plane had gotten hit and crashed in the water and sank, and eventually pointed to a picture of Iwo Jima and said that's where he was shot down, and also even gave the first and last name of a friend on the ship named Jack Larson. Well, it turned out there was this USS Natoma Bay that was involved in Iwo Jima, and they lost only one pilot during the Iwo Jima operation, and his death was exactly as James had described, and one of the pilots on the mission when he was killed was Jack Larson. So that was one where you got A lot of these cases, and it's sort of like you can imagine when you have a dream, names aren't necessarily part of what kind of sticks with you, it's more the experience. But then you get a case like this where the kid does have names, very specific ones that turn out to match perfectly with the person whose life he seems to be remembering. So yeah, that's quite a strong case. James is now a young adult, so he's moved on from that, but it certainly is a very impressive case.
Yeah, I think that from memory, he knew where the plane was shot down and was able to identify the location where it was underwater.
Well, actually, the wreckage of the plane has never been found.
Oh, okay.
So, I mean, as specific as he got was Iwo Jima, but he and his parents did eventually visit there when he was a little bit older, and they did a little bit of a memorial type thing to the pilot, for the pilot, which was quite meaningful to them.
Oh, wow. So what would you tell a skeptic who thinks that this stuff is all bunk? I'm thinking of a family member right now, for example, who I gave him kind of a little bit of a reading list to send him several books, in fact, to help him to get over his resistance to even opening them. One of those books was Many Lives, Many Masters, but another one was Proof of Heaven. And he's still he's still not with the program. He thinks that this is pretty much it. And I would love for him to know that there is more to life than meets the eye, and that he's not just going to disappear after he goes.
Well, it's a good question. How do you change someone's mind? I think what we basically do is do the best job we can, put the information out there, and then people will make of it what they will. And if there are plenty of people who are open to it and they find the work meaningful, and then of course there are others who are not so open. I think I wrote up a case report of James Leininger that we were just describing that was published in a paper. It's available on our website. And that's very short. You don't have to read a whole book. You read 5 pages or however long it is. And, if someone reads that and thinks this is absolute rubbish, well, then you probably don't need to read the books. But, we're all on our own journey, and some of us are open to things that others aren't, and that's okay.
Yeah, right. And so I'll include, by the way, the link to that particular write-up in the show notes for this episode. What would be the most surprising discovery that you personally have come across through all this work in this area?
Well, I guess it depends what you mean by discovery, but there are times that I've been surprised in cases, and actually with James's, it was a pleasant surprise when he and his parents, basically his parents, when he did a television interview when he was very little, before the pilot had been identified. And I got a copy of it because it's for a program that I was also interviewed for. The program actually never aired, but ABC News had sent me a copy of it. Well, when it dawned on me that interview was evidence, that it was documenting what James had said before anyone knew anything about the pilot, then sort of the light went on, and I realized, boy, that's going to be an important piece of this case, and I think it is. I also recently, and I write about this case in the introduction to Before. Recently, we've had the opportunity to do some picture recognition tests, where I will show a young child a picture from what we think is the past life versus a control picture, and ask him, in this case, which one he remembers. Well, I did one as a little boy who remembered a past life in the Vietnam War. So anyway, I was able to do picture tests with him. Did 8 picture tests. 2 of them he did not make a choice on. For the other 6, he was 6 out of 6, pointing to the person from or place from the past life. So that impressed me. It certainly would go, it's like flipping a coin having it come up heads 6 times out of 6. I mean, it happens, but it doesn't happen very often. It'd be like a 1.5% chance. So when we get evidence like that we can add on to the other aspects of the case, then that again is kind of a pleasant surprise that because it really strengthens the quality of the evidence.
Mm. Are there other organizations or university departments that are doing similar sort of work to what you guys are doing at UVA?
There are not other departments doing specifically what we do, especially our focus on survival or the question of life after death. There have been other people in academics who have done this kind of work with the children's past lives, not a whole institution, but more an individual researcher. There was one who passed away last year, Erlendur Haraldsson from Iceland, who was quite prolific and produced quite a lot of good work. And there have been other people, psychologists in Australia, one in India, an anthropologist up in Canada. So there are people who have done the same kind of work and gotten the same kind of results, found these kids with verifiable memories from a past life.
Hmm. So you mentioned Erlander. I don't really know much about him, but what was something that really stands out that he did in his body of work?
Well, he was quite varied in his work, but he was also quite meticulous. So he studied these cases like we have and produced some very good cases. One thing he did that we had not done, we've since done it a little bit, was he did some psychological testing on some of these kids, compared them to controls to see, for instance, do these kids, are they more suggestible? Do they have bigger imaginations that could allow them or could cause them to have these memories? And in fact, the testing showed they did not. In his testing and also in ours with the American cases, the one thing that comes out of the testing, the one significant finding is that these kids tend to be very intelligent and very verbal. So that may enable them to describe these kind of memories or images that they're having at an early age. The average age when they start is 35 months, so it's a very early age. Whereas there may be other kids that also have some of those kind of memories, but they're not able to verbalize them. They don't become as concrete, and then they kind of fade by the time the kids get able to talk. So that was certainly a contribution that Erlander made. He also did some work with mediums, actually, and had some very impressive cases there. So he was a great researcher.
Awesome. I'll have to look him up. Now, some kids can see angels or purport to see angels, and I'm curious where that fits in here. Do many of the kids who report past life memories, do they also report seeing angels, or is that something that's unique between those two different sets?
Occasionally they do, but we get emails from parents whose children talk about seeing angels. They usually are not the same children who are talking about past lives. They can be, but they're usually not. And in fact, with the children who have past life memories, very few of them, according to the parents, have any sort of psychic abilities. They're just kind of ordinary kids, except they have these memories. The thing about young children seeing angels, occasionally you'll get stories where the angel will be like a deceased grandfather who gives the child information that they presumably couldn't have known otherwise. But for the most part, they are benign. They're often a comfort to the children, and they are also unverifiable. There's nothing you can kind of do with that case to say, okay, that's actually an angel. And of course, with older kids, if you're talking about hallucinations, then you get more concerned from a psychiatric standpoint. But for a 3-year-old to talk about seeing an angel in the corner is not all that rare, and for the most part, again, seems to be perfectly benign.
Right. And speaking of seeing things that are verifiable and evidence-based, this isn't something that is kind of able to be put into study, I would imagine. But one case that comes to mind, I learned of from Karen Noe, who is a pretty famous medium I had on this podcast. And she told me about one of her clients had a father pass away, and she was quite certain there was a large sum of money that he had hidden somewhere, but they tore the house all apart looking for it, and they didn't find anything. Well, in a reading, the medium Karen was able to communicate with the father and relay the information that the woman was looking for, that the money was hidden in the attic, in a certain corner of the attic, behind a bunch of pink insulation in the wall. And sure enough, the woman found the money there, and it was quite a substantial amount of money. So that's pretty amazing. You can't argue that if you're the person who experienced that, if that's your father. But to hear that story as somebody who's skeptical, you might think, okay, well, that could be totally fabricated. So.
Well, sure, it could be. But it would be a case worth investigating. I mean, what you would try to do is interview, obviously, the medium and the sitter, and hopefully there's a recording of readings, because most of the time mediums do let people record. And then, you'd interview the family and find out the details about the money and so forth. And if it holds up, I mean, that would be a case worth publishing. I mean, that's certainly, like you said, it's kind of hard to ignore that, if it happens to you. And there have been cases previously similar to that, like a deceased who's wanting to make known where the last will, had been hidden and that sort of thing. There are those cases, but there aren't a lot of them. So that could be an important case.
Okay. Well, if you're interested, I can put you in contact with Karen.
Yeah, sure.
Awesome.
Sounds good.
Awesome. Now, do you ever hear of signs that come in almost indisputable form? Again, it's not verifiable if it's a personal experience, but one happened to me early this year, and I have to tell you that I did not believe I was psychic. I did not believe in psychics, mediums, any of it a little over a year ago, until a medium I interviewed for the show, which was unusual at the time. I only had one other medium, Paul Selig, on it up until that point. But this particular medium I met in a mastermind that I'm in, a men's group called Metal. And he saved my family member's life while the interview was happening. And you can't make this stuff up. I mean, it's just too fantastical. And it happened to me, so I don't need any further verification, because this family member wouldn't have been alive if I hadn't interviewed at that moment. In the whole 3-week time stretch, he was the only interview I did to... I just was in preparation of moving cross country, and so that's why I wasn't taking other interviews. But I felt compelled to have him on, and so anyways, that opened the door. Lots of things have happened over. If my listeners know a bit more about this, because I've had a lot of episodes about spirituality and outside the norm sort of things in the last. Certainly the last 7 or 8 months. Okay, so here's the experience. I'm reading from a book that I feel kind of called to examine. I'm just following the intuitive breadcrumbs. And I didn't even buy the book. I was just looking at the book through the Amazon Look Inside the Book feature. While I'm reading that book, just the introduction, I think it was, I'm also listening to a podcast in the background, completely unrelated. It was the Melissa Rivers Show. The book, by the way, was called Ask White Dove. It's like an FAQ, an Ask Me Anything, from the medium Michelle White Dove. So I'm reading from that book. I'm listening to the podcast. It's an episode about coronavirus from like April of last year. And the word I'm reading at the moment I'm reading it comes through the podcast. That was super freaky. I'd never experienced that ever before in my life. Mm-hmm. But I do nothing. I continue to keep reading. So it happens again 5 minutes later. Like, the odds of that must be astronomically small. That second time I remember what the word was. It was the word parents. And the book wasn't about parenting. the podcast episode wasn't about parenting. And it was at the exact moment. It was just mind blowing. So I did follow the breadcrumbs, and there were some pretty impactful things that happened in my life because of continuing down that particular rabbit hole that day. But I'll save that for another time. But the whole experience of listening and reading at the same time and having synchronicity like that, is that something that you've come across pretty often, or is that very unusual?
Well, I mean, there are people who study synchronicities. In fact, there's Bernie Beitman is someone who's a friend of the division. He's a psychiatrist. In fact, he's written a book about them, or coincidences, whatever you want to call it, but meaningful coincidences, which Jung obviously talked about synchronicities a lot. And what you make of them, of course, is up to the individual. Some people interpret it as, say, a deceased loved one looking over them, or a guide or somebody kind of helping them along. There would also, with more of a Jungian approach of there being this sort of connection between the mental and the physical, and how there may be this sort of core that affects both. So it affects both sort of our thoughts, but also things happening in the world. So anyway, there are a lot of interpretations. If people get these after somebody has died, then they often find them quite meaningful, where they're thinking about, say, the person's favorite song, and it comes on the radio, or various things. So if you're open to it, you can certainly conclude something is going on here. And maybe we don't have to figure out exactly what, but just understand that there's more kind of to this reality than we're often aware of.
Yeah, and so you mentioned Carl Jung. I had no idea that he was the person who coined the term synchronicity until just a few months ago, when I was, or maybe 6 months ago, when I was really heavy into learning everything I could about all the different kinds of psychic phenomena. So what would you say is some of the most meaningful research that Carl Jung has done in regards to synchronicity? Because he did a ton of research, and then he wrote an entire book about the topic after experiencing this without a doubt sign that just couldn't see happening by random chance. So yeah, what pops to your mind?
Well, you're sort of testing my memory here. I mean, I have read his work on synchronicity, but it's been quite a few years ago. But also, he and Wolfgang Pauli, who is a quantum physicist, they also did work together, kind of exploring basically reality and consciousness, and sort of the connections between the physical and the mental. So there's certainly a lot there. If people are interested, I mean, Carl Jung was, along with being one of the early huge figures in psychiatry, he was also quite a mystic, and wrote some pretty interesting stuff.
Yeah, so he's the one of the major figures around the idea of the collective unconscious, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Now, what would you say to Elon Musk, who says that we're living in a simulation that was created by a very advanced race of us, and they're just trying to essentially create a Leisure Suit Larry or The Sims sort of simulation of what their primitive race was like, and that's us.
Yeah, I mean, people have published papers in scientific journals making that case, that it's more likely that we're simulation than we're actually the real thing. I must say that doesn't really connect with me much. But I think the idea that, which is sort of related to it, the idea that sort of consciousness is fundamental, that the mental is sort of what's fundamental about reality, and then the physical reality grows from it. I mean, that I'm very open to. And so you can then cast that in different ways and say it's some advanced system who's, basically like, what was the movie? Drawing a blank, where everything was a simulation. And
Inception?
No, that was a good one too, but it'll probably come to me. But the idea that basically the physical world is not what we think it is. I mean, it's what we experience, but it's not primary. It seems to us that we're here in this world, this physical world is what's ultimately primary. But there's good reason to think actually that it's not, that it's more consciousness that's primary. Interesting stuff to think about.
I guess you're probably talking about the movie The Matrix.
Exactly, The Matrix, yes.
I just recently rewatched that.
Great
that was
movie.
a great movie, and it's been many, many years, and I just saw it again. That's deep. It's deep stuff.
Yeah.
The sequel, not so not so good comparatively, but
I confess I didn't even watch the third one because the second one kind of left me dissatisfied. But the first one's a really great movie.
Yeah, amazing. I also love the movie Contact. I thought that was a really profound movie too.
Now remind me which one that is, because I get the names confused. Is who was in that?
What's her name?
Jodie Foster
thank
was
you.
in one.
That's the one.
Okay, yeah, okay, it's been years since I saw that, but there are a lot of good movies that explore themes sort of in this general ballpark about what is reality and then what's our role in it, and it's fun to watch those.
Yeah, one of my favorite science fiction movies that's targeting kids and is very hopeful is called The Last Mimsy. Yeah. Have you ever?
Don't know it.
That's a good one. I really like that one.
Yeah.
So, what would be some practical kind of implementation advice that you would give based on all this research? Like, what do people do with this that helps impact their lives in a positive way?
Well, I think people really delve into this work, and near-death experiences, that's another area. I mean, you mentioned proof of heaven. Near-death experiences, there's been a lot of serious-minded work with it. Bruce Grayson here is our expert. I think with all of this, if people have anxiety about death, which is kind of part of life in a way, if people have anxiety about death that's troubling them, then delving into this work, I think, can be comforting to them. And I also hope that people take from it that there may be this aspect of us, which you can call spiritual if you want, but this aspect of us separate from just this physical body and physical world, that we all share, that we all have, that we are all more than just sort of the personality that you see. And if that helps people treat each other a little better, then that would certainly be great.
So what would be the key takeaway for somebody who's read the book before, your book?
Well, I think the key takeaway is that it looks like some people come back here after they die. I mean, that would be a conclusion, a reasonable conclusion for people to draw. I know, they may draw different conclusions, but that's certainly there. And then you, in a way, you might wonder, well, so what? But again, it can be comforting to know that we hopefully can get another shot at trying to make ourselves better, and it can be comforting to think that maybe we get to have more experiences with our loved ones after we're gone this time around.
And what would you tell somebody who is a devout follower of their religion, and their religion specifically denies any reincarnation?
Well, if this material is too upsetting to them, then I would recommend they just ignore it. But there are a lot of people so polls have shown 20% of American Christians actually believe in reincarnation. And James Leininger's father, for instance, was a Christian who was opposed to the idea of past lives until his son seemed to start remembering one. And in that case, then he and what the polls show, others, they incorporate the belief into their overall religious beliefs, so it doesn't challenge their Christian beliefs, it just adds to them.
Gotcha. And so where does the NDE, or near-death experience, fit into this whole picture? We got mediumship, you have the past life memories, and I know channeling is a little different from mediumship, and there's other extrasensory perceptions and things, telepathy, all this sort of stuff, and seeing angels, receiving messages, different kinds of signs, feathers keep showing up on the person's path, and so forth. Where does an NDE fit into this, and how does one extract some scientific evidence of a bigger picture from it?
Well, I think as far as the scientific evidence, most of our papers on near-death experiences are available on our website. And then Bruce Grayson, who I just mentioned, he's now written a book called After. So nice bookend with...
Yes.
He came up with his title. He came up with his title first, but we've got before and after. Now we just need to write one during. But what near-death experiences, where they fit in, is that people who are very near death, often their hearts have stopped and so forth, but then they often describe reaching sort of a point of no return and being sent back. So they fit in because they didn't completely die; they came back. But their experiences often involve spiritual kinds of experiences, and some of our kids talk about time between lives, often describing essentially a near-death experience where they see themselves floating above the body, only they did not return, that they moved on. So the near-death experience work is all one piece of this overall picture, like you described.
Have you done any work yourself on NDEs?
Well, just a little. When I first started here, volunteering sometime, I was part of a study looking at the medical records of people who have had near-death experiences to see how close they actually were to death. So I took part in that a little bit, but then I got focused on the past life memories instead.
Okay. Do you have any favorite books, especially in relation to all the stuff that we've covered in this episode, that you want to share with our listener / viewer, or favorite TV shows or movies that could be great documentaries for somebody as a starting point?
Well, you may know on Netflix, there's a series that came out in January called Surviving Death. And the first episode is on near-death experiences, and the last episode is on children's past life memories. So those are certainly worth checking out. Book-wise, we've already mentioned a couple of books. If people are more interested in studying psychics in the lab, or looking at psychic abilities, I should say, Dean Radin is a scientist who's written some very good books, including The Conscious Universe, that looks at all the lab work on psychic abilities. So that one's worth checking out.
Now, I'll share quickly a really compelling story regarding Surviving Death, that Netflix show. One of my family members lost her grandmother in January, and she's not really into anything spiritual, so it was a little bit of a stretch for her to be watching that show, Surviving Death, but she was, and she saw the episode about how to ask for signs from your loved ones who have passed. And it wasn't even minutes later, she walks outside, and on the driveway is a brochure that had the words, "I love you, granddaughter," and a picture of a music box on the cover not any old music box, but the music box that her grandmother had given her decades ago. Really, really compelling.
That's quite a sign. Yeah, that's great.
So you get these things that collectively it's overwhelming evidence, but people just keep that to themselves, to their family, to their trusted friends and so forth. I mean, I just learned recently about a friend of mine, not a close friend, but she's involved in the Tony Robbins world. I was a platinum partner for many years, for 3 years, and she was in that community, and she said to me that she saw angels last year, and that really surprised me. She's a very, I don't know, just very practical. But I don't know why it surprises me, because it's seems to be happening a lot. As I talk to people about some of the experiences I'm having, I'm getting a lot more verification from others, like, yeah, they're having stuff show up for them too. So I'm curious, do you see like an acceleration happening in these sorts of psychic phenomenons and signs?
Well, that's hard to say, because we don't really know, like you say, how common they are in general, because people often don't talk about them. But you never know who's open to them, and you never know who's having the experiences themselves. I mean, certainly we'll get emails from very grounded business people, or I mean, all sorts, who are having things happening to them. So it's certainly out there, and it's good if people can share that, but I understand that they want to be able to share it with people they trust, because it's material that they can feel quite vulnerable.
You can get a lot of judgment, a lot of dismissal, ridicule, ostracization, or whatever the word is. So getting ostracized. I've felt it from family members when I disclose some of the things that have happened to me in the last 6-8 months. Especially people who say they're very devout, and then they come in with so much judgment, and it's hard. It's hard to I have to calibrate. I have to know when I say or disclose some of the experiences I've had, and when not to, because it's just not worth the grief.
That's right. Unfortunately,
but I think it's changing. I think collectively there's a shift that is happening. I'm seeing more and more people open-minded. This phrase I love. It's the willing suspension of disbelief, and I'm seeing a lot more of that. A lot more of that. So that's heartening.
Good. Yeah. Certainly hope so. Yeah.
All right.
Good.
Well, thank you. And is there any last word or nugget of wisdom that you want to share with our listener and viewer to round out this episode?
No, but I appreciate the opportunity to be on, and certainly I've enjoyed our conversation.
Likewise. And so, in order for our listener to get your books, or I guess the one book to get is the combination of the two, the Before book, because that's a 2-in-1. They can find that on Amazon, I'm sure. But what about all your other studies and musings and so forth? Are you active on social media, or should they just go to your department's website?
Well, I have a personal website, jimbtucker.com, or they can go to our departmental website, like you say, where the Division of Perceptual Studies, I guess you'll probably have links, but Division of Perceptual Studies, or DOPS, so uvadops.org is the alias for our website. And we've got the vast majority of the papers that we've ever put out are available as PDFs on our website, so people can certainly check those out.
Well, thank you so much. This was a real pleasure and really eye-opening, and I'm sure our listeners are further empowered to go to their friends and loved ones who are diehard skeptics.
Yeah. Well, I hope so. But yeah, thanks very much for having me.
Thank you, listener. We'll catch you on the next episode. I'm your host, Stephan Spencer, signing off.